All right, hey friends, today we are going to be taking a look at another music theory concept, and this is going to be intervals. So we are going to discuss what intervals are, how we name them, and various different things like that. So without further ado, let's get going. So the first big question that we're going to ask is, what is an interval? So an interval is talking about the distance between two pitches in music. Intervals are going to be counted by starting on the original pitch and counting all the lines and spaces between those until you reach the next pitch. So we're talking about when we have one pitch on the staff and we want to know how far away it is from any other pitch that we have that occurs after it. So we're going to refer to the interval by its distance. So it's going to have a number name. Now, this is not in place of its letter name because they are still letters. They still have a specific pitch that exists on the staff. What we're going to talk about is the distance between those 2 points is going to have its number name. So we're talking about things like seconds, thirds, fourths, and so on and so forth. Now, within the term interval, there are two main types of interval that we need to be aware of. There is the harmonic interval and the melodic interval. We're going to tackle the melodic interval first. So let's take a look at what that means. Melodic intervals are when you have two pitches that are played in succession. So let me turn on my little laser pointer here. What we're talking about is when pitches are played right after one another. So we're looking from left to right on our music. So when we go from this C right here, the next note in order is that F. So we're talking about the interval between C and F, the amount of space that exists between those two sounds. Now, if you're a piano player, you can probably start to visualize this a little bit. But if you're, like me, where it's an instrument player, sometimes this is a little bit of a harder concept. So we're going to discuss how we name intervals in just a moment. But just be aware that melodic intervals are going from left to right. Okay, folks, left to right. And that's how we read those. Now, when we talk about harmonic intervals, a harmonic interval is the space between two pitches that are played simultaneously. So when we play in succession, like from the melodic intervals, they're one after another. Simultaneously means they are happening at the same time. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at the notes that are stacked on top of one another. Now, could we find the interval between the pitches going left to right? Of course we can. But that is no longer a harmonic interval if we do that. Harmonic intervals only exist going vertically. Those are the ones that we are talking about. We're talking about things like the space between that C and G, or the F and the A right here, or E and F right there. Now, there is a unique one over here that I want you to look at here. Now, these two pitches are on the same spot. They are underneath that first ledger line on that low B right there. Now, that is a specific type of interval. That is not just something that I threw in there to mess with you. We see this mostly in piano and vocal compositions, but every now and again you will see it in instrumental scores talking about, when we're layering parts together and things of that nature. Now, this is an actual harmonic interval. And like I said, we're going to discuss the names of the intervals in just a moment here. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind that that is something that we'll see as well. So when we're talking about the harmonic and melodic categories, we also can break it down even further into the different types of intervals we have. There are simple intervals and compound intervals. So these are two really fancy terms for a very simple concept. It's going to talk about the distance between the two pitches. A simple interval is less than or equal to an octave. So remember, an octave is 8 steps because, that prefix oct, OCT, 4 and 4, 8 right there. So we've got octave. It is less than or equal to an octave. So we're talking about numbers that are less than 8. So if we're going to go to a compound interval, that is going to be numbers or intervals, that are greater than an octave. So we're talking about numbers that are greater than 8 to name those intervals between the pitches. So let's do a couple examples here. Let's take a look at some simple intervals. So once again, intervals that are less than or equal to 1 octave are called simple intervals. So in this category, we have the following names. So down here, That one that I showed you before, where they're on the same one, we call this unison because they are the same pitch. They are playing at the same time. They are in unison. When we go up and we have this kind of goofy looking thing right here where it is right next door, we have one, two notes right there. So we have our second. Now, even if we only have two notes still here, but there is another extra space between it, we're going to get more into this later, okay, folks? So if this part doesn't really completely make sense to you yet, we're going to break this down a little bit more. But if we start on this C right here and then DE right there, we see that we have one, two, three notes between those two right there. So that's our third. And then fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, until we reach our octave right here. Now, could we call this a first and this an eighth? Yes, technically that's what they are. However, in music, we do not refer to a unison as a first. We do not refer to an octave as an eighth most of the time, just because we have other names that allow us to be a little bit more clear about what it is we are seeing. So we use unison and octave to refer to those notes where they're playing exactly the same or they're playing 8 steps apart from one another. Now, once again, if naming these intervals doesn't make a ton of sense to you just yet, please hold on because we are going to get to it. Once we get through this little introduction to simple and compound, we are going to learn how we are going to discover what those intervals are. So moving ahead here, looking at compound intervals. Now remember, compound intervals are larger than 1 octave. So in this category, we're talking about numbers that are greater than 8 because remember, an eighth is an octave. We just refer to it as an octave. So we're talking about things like a ninth right here, where we count up and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 places between those two pitches, counting all of the notes in between. We can also go up to our 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th. Now, if we get to something called a 15th over here, it exists. There are larger intervals than a 14th. However, a 15th is where you start getting into things like the double octave and various other things like that. I wanted to keep it reasonably simple for this introduction here, so we're not going to go much past the 14th, where we have, from right up there, the 9th through the 14th. So that is our compound interval. The big thing I want you to remember, though, folks, simple intervals, less than or equal to 1 octave. Compound intervals, greater than 1 octave. Okay, that's the important part for simple versus compound. So now, here is the primary part of what I want us to work on here. We are going to find our interval. So in order to find the interval between those two pitches, we have to count the number of pitches between those two that are in question here. So we're going to take this simple melodic interval because remember, melodic means that they're not stacked on top of one another. They are in succession like this. Now, what we already know is that we have middle C using our strategy of crawl space. Please remember that from before. And we also have G on that second line because every good boy does fine. So what the first step that you want to do is identify what those pitches are, just so you start to build an awareness of pitch and things like that. The next thing we're going to do is find how many pitches are in between those two. Now, conventional counting says that we don't necessarily count the first one. So if we were starting on C, we'd go D would be 1, 3, 2, 3, 4. And we would say that C to G is 4 spaces. Now, unfortunately, that's not how counting in music is going to work. Counting in music is always going to count the first pitch as well. So we always label that as 1. So our C right there from before is 1. Because if we had another interval right there, it would be a first. It would be 1. They would be in unison. We move up to D, which is 2. E is 3. F is 4. And finally, G is 5. So we can see that there are 5 pitches between C and G. Right? So there we got those 5 pitches, C, D, E, F, and G. If you count all those right there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there is your 5th. And like I said, once we have counted our interval, we know that number is going to become its name. So rather than calling it a 5, we call it a fifth. So you can see right there, I've labeled that for you. Between C and G, that is your fifth down there like that. So this works for all of the different numbers that we have on there. This can, I mean, even the compound intervals, we still count them the exact same way. Now, there are some shortcuts, like you can start to get pretty good at recognizing visually, oh, okay, cool. I can see right here that, from the ledger line to the second line, I know that that's a fifth. Or, you can start to see, oh, okay, there's C and then the C above it. Just visually, I don't have to count that. I know it's an octave and things like that. So there are some shortcuts, of course. However, in the beginning, it's very beneficial to make sure that you are counting your intervals to double check and make sure that you are doing it correctly. So let's do a little bit of a recap here, folks. Kind of given a shorter little lecture here today. I know that the last couple have gotten a little bit longer. So we're going to try to shorten this up for you a little bit. So just to recap, an interval is the distance between two pitches. And there are two main types of intervals, harmonic and melodic. Once again, harmonic is when you have intervals that are stacked on top of one another, they go vertically. Melodic intervals are when they are in succession, they go horizontally from left to right. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We also have two different types of intervals within those categories. We have simple intervals, which are less than or equal to one octave. And those, of course, are unisons, seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, and then your octaves. Compound intervals are going to be larger, greater than an octave. So we're talking about ninths, tenths, elevenths, twelfths, thirteenths, and 14ths. Now, as I said, you can go above 14th, of course, but we don't usually use those right now because then we're getting into, like I said, double octave territory, things like that. There is no negative intervals. You even if you're going down, you still count positive numbers. So that's something that I probably should have mentioned. Let's go back here, just a couple of slides real fast. So, for example, if we're looking at these intervals right here, I know that we went backwards quite a bit here, but if we're looking at intervals going downward, like this one right here, if we look, just because we're going down does not mean we have a negative number. So, when you're counting, you would start right here, and this would still be number one. So, that B right there is one. As you go to the next space, you got two, then that line right there, three. There's your four, five, six. Oops, didn't mean to go forward. Six is underneath the line right there. Seven is the ledger line. And then there's your octave right there because this is an octave B. So we still count positive numbers going downward as well. It just happens to be, like we would say it's an octave going lower. Or if we're going from this right here, this F down to this B, we would say that this is a fifth below the F right there. So one, two, three, four, and five. On the other side of that, the interval that we discovered previously, this fifth right here, we could say that G is a fifth above C. So you can also add the placement descriptor, that above or below, and that will start to help you figure out where you're at. But like I said, the main thing to take away are these interval numbers and the ability to count those intervals. So we always start counting on the pitch that we have, the first pitch, as number one. So that means that we are always going to have one through whatever. So we always have to have that starting there. Okay? All right. Hopefully you've got this now. So we're going to have a couple of self check questions. And like I said, you're going to have a little bit of a shorter lesson here today, folks. All right? Please make sure you reach out with any questions. Let me know if I can help you in any way. And let's get going with the next part of our lesson.